The evening air in Portland, Oregon was crisp, with the soft hum of the city fading away as Mrs. Jacobs stepped inside Magnolia's bistro. The moment she entered, the atmosphere wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Calm, elegant, refined. The bistro, with its soft, golden lighting, delicate clinking of glasses, and low hum of conversation, radiated a welcoming charm. The hostess, a young woman with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, greeted her with a stiff nod and a forced, "Good evening, ma'am." "Reservation for Mrs. Jacobs," she said in a voice that lacked the warmth typically expected of such an establishment. Still, Mrs. Jacobs remained poised, her gentle smile meeting the hostess' eyes. She was used to moments like this. Her age and the skin she wore had made her a subject of both admiration and discomfort in many spaces. But she knew how to carry herself, how to glide through the world with a quiet grace that demanded respect, whether it was freely given or not. The hostess checked her list and nodded, leading her towards a table near the kitchen. The space, though beautifully arranged with crisp white tablecloths and elegant centerpieces, felt less than ideal for a lady of Mrs. Jacobs' standing. It was a busy evening, after all, and not every table could be the best. She didn't mind. She had been to many fine restaurants, and she knew what mattered wasn't the seat. It was the company and the experience. As she settled into the chair, her eyes scanned the room with calm observation. Patrons were engaged in lively conversations, their laughter floating through the air, punctuated by the soft sounds of jazz playing in the background. The air was thick with the scent of gourmet food, freshly baked bread, and fine wines. Mrs. Jacobs placed her hands gently on the table, folding them together with the elegance of someone who had lived through decades of life's challenges and triumphs. There was something undeniably dignified in the way she moved, the way she breathed in the ambience of the restaurant. The hostess, still with that strained smile, left her with a polite, "I'll send your server right over," and quickly moved on to the next table. Mrs. Jacobs gave a brief nod in response, not expecting anything extraordinary, but hoping for a quiet evening, a meal without complication. But as she sat, waiting for her server to arrive, she noticed the first signs of something not quite right. Mark, the waiter, passed by her table several times, his eyes averted each time he came close. He didn't acknowledge her. Not a glance, not a smile, not even a polite nod. He was busy attending to the tables nearby, young couples, businessmen, families, but never once did his attention land on Mrs. Jacobs. She observed this quietly, her gaze steady. It was subtle at first. The occasional glance of other diners, wondering why their server wasn't attending to her, the polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. She remained unmoved, her demeanor calm and composed. In the world she had lived, she had seen many forms of disrespect, but she had also learned how to weather them with patience, letting time expose the true character of others. Minutes passed, and yet Mark continued to serve others without acknowledging her presence. She saw the way he darted around, chatting with patrons, joking with some of the guests at a nearby table. He wasn't busy. He was deliberately avoiding her. Mrs. Jacobs's patience, owned over the years, remained intact, but she couldn't help but notice the side glances from the other diners, their curiosity now turning into open confusion. Why wasn't she being served? Was it an oversight or something more intentional? Her table was in the far corner of the room, away from the bustling hub of activity, but it was hardly in a spot that justified being overlooked so blatantly. The longer she waited, the more she sensed the growing discomfort in the room. A young couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, their eyes flickering between Mrs. Jacobs and Mark, who was too engrossed in talking to others to acknowledge the woman who had been sitting there for far too long without service. Still, she did nothing. Mrs. Jacobs had learned long ago that there was power in silence, in waiting for others to reveal themselves. She let the minutes stretch out, feeling the weight of her calm, watching the drama unfold quietly around her. And yet, despite the awkwardness building in the air, she didn't flinch. She didn't rise to confront Mark. There was a grace in her patience, a quiet dignity that made it clear that while she was being overlooked, she was not in any way invisible. The discomfort in the room continued to grow, but Mrs. Jacobs remained as she had always been, composed, a calm presence amidst the storm. The whispers of confusion and subtle murmurs from other patrons filled the air, but they didn't sway her. She was used to it. She had faced far worse than this, and she knew exactly how to handle it. The evening was still young, and there was more to come. She would wait. After what seemed like an eternity, Mark finally approached Mrs. Jacobs's table, his eyes not meeting hers, but instead focused on a menu he pretended to examine. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with the kind of brash confidence that often came with inexperience. His neatly pressed shirt and apron did little to mask the impatience and dismissiveness that emanated from him. He stood beside her table for a moment, his posture stiff, avoiding direct eye contact. "Apologies for the delay, ma'am," Mark said curtly, though the apology lacked any real sincerity. His voice was sharp, a stark contrast to the gentle hum of conversation around them. "We're a little understaffed tonight. It's been hectic." Mrs. Jacobs glanced at him, her eyes soft but unwavering. She had heard that excuse countless times before. "That's all right," she replied calmly, her tone betraying no emotion. "I'm ready to place my order." Mark gave a quick nod, but didn't seem to make a move to take her order. Instead, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing over his shoulder as though he were eager to get back to other more important tables. The discomfort between them was palpable. He remained standing there, waiting for her to speak, clearly unprepared for a patient woman who wasn't going to make a scene, but wasn't going to let him off the hook either. Mrs. Jacobs, without missing a beat, politely repeated her request. "I'll take the salmon, please, and a glass of the white wine you have on the list." Still, Mark didn't take her order immediately. Instead, he gave a half-hearted "sure" before walking away without so much as a smile. He didn't even bother to take a pen out to jot it down. He turned back to the other side of the room, already engaged in a conversation with another group, laughing and gesturing as though Mrs. Jacobs didn't exist. The growing tension in the air was impossible to ignore. People were now openly staring, unsure whether to speak up or keep quiet. As Mark continued to serve the other tables, attending to patrons who clearly had no issue receiving prompt service, Mrs. Jacobs continued to wait. Her face remained impassive, but her mind was already calculating what she would do next. She was no stranger to adversity, to being ignored, to being treated as though she didn't belong. But this was different. This wasn't about her. This was about respect, and the lack of it. And she would wait for Mark to reveal just how far he was willing to go. Meanwhile, the room had become noticeably more uneasy. A young couple sitting nearby exchanged glances, unsure of what to do, their whispered words trailing off into silence. A man at another table, who had witnessed the scene unfold, narrowed his eyes at Mark, who was still laughing with his group, all while Mrs. Jacobs sat in the corner like an invisible figure, patiently enduring the slight. The discomfort in the restaurant continued to mount. It wasn't just the lack of service anymore, it was the way Mrs. Jacobs was being treated. The air was thick with a subtle but undeniable tension, and the longer it persisted, the more everyone in the room felt it. Those who had been enjoying their evening now found their enjoyment fading, replaced with an uncomfortable awareness that something was very wrong. But still, Mrs. Jacobs sat unmoved. Her patience was unwavering. She had faced worse in her life, far worse. This was small in comparison, yet she knew that sometimes allowing people to expose their true character was more powerful than confronting them directly. She wasn't interested in petty arguments. She simply wanted to be treated with the dignity she deserved. And she would wait for that moment, however long it took. Across the room, Miles Jacobs, the restaurant's owner, watched the situation unfold with growing frustration. He had been sitting at his usual corner booth, enjoying a quiet evening with a few close associates, when his attention was drawn to his mother. He hadn't noticed her arrival at first, as she had entered the restaurant quietly, as she always did, but now he could see her, sitting there, alone, completely ignored by the very people who should have been serving her. His pulse quickened as he noticed Mark's repeated neglect. His anger, quiet at first, began to build, a slow burn that spread through his chest. Miles had spent years building Magnolia's Bistro into one of Portland's most respected dining establishments. And it was a place where people of all backgrounds were welcomed with warmth and hospitality. It had been a place where he prided himself on ensuring that everyone, no matter who they were, felt like they belonged. And here was his mother, an elder woman, dignified and composed, being treated with blatant disregard. He saw the subtle shifts in the room as well, the way the patrons glanced from one another to Mrs. Jacobs, their discomfort growing with each passing minute. It wasn't just his mother who was being affected. The entire atmosphere of the restaurant had changed. The energy in the air was thick with uncertainty, and it was clear that people were starting to take notice. And yet, Mark, oblivious to the growing tension, continued to serve the other tables, laughing and joking with guests, ignoring the glaring issue in front of him. Miles's gaze hardened. He wasn't one to lose his temper easily. He had worked hard to remain level-headed in difficult situations. But there was something about this, something about seeing his mother treated this way, that stirred something deep within him. He couldn't let it slide. He wouldn't. As Mark walked past his mother again, completely ignoring her, Miles stood up from his booth. His movements were purposeful, every step deliberate as he made his way across the room. The quiet hum of conversation seemed to fade as he passed through the restaurant, his presence commanding attention, a sense of authority radiating from him. He wasn't angry, yet, but he was resolute. He had built this place with a commitment to hospitality, as to treating every patron with the respect they deserved. And he would ensure that his standards were upheld. The moment had come for him to confront Mark. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as Miles approached, his footsteps now the only sound that filled the room. As Miles neared Mark, the entire atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The chatter and clinking glasses seemed to quiet down, the murmurs now filled with an undercurrent of curiosity. Patrons who had been minding their own business suddenly became acutely aware of the situation, their eyes flicking between the two men. It was as though the temperature in the room had dropped, the once welcoming space now charged with a palpable tension. Mark, completely unaware of the storm approaching him, was finishing up with a nearby table. He laughed, still loud and unaffected, as he moved to refill the water glass of a couple seated by the window. His casual disregard of Mrs. Jacobs had grown even more apparent now that it was impossible to ignore. He hadn't once acknowledged her, let alone approached her table to offer an apology or an explanation. He was treating her like a ghost, someone invisible, not worth his time or attention. The young couple at the table next to Mrs. Jacobs exchanged a look, both of them quietly discussing the strange behavior of the waiter. They couldn't help but notice how Mark had been busy attending to every other guest, while Mrs. Jacobs sat alone, untouched, almost as if she were a forgotten relic in the corner. They were starting to feel uncomfortable, complicit even, in their own silence, and yet they didn't want to stir the pot. At another table near the bar, an older man with a silver beard leaned over to his companion and whispered, "What's going on with that woman? She's been waiting there for ages." His companion, a woman in her mid-50s with short, cropped hair, glanced over at Mrs. Jacobs. "I'm not sure, but it's obvious she's not being treated well." The older man nodded, his brow furrowed in quiet disapproval. "Seems wrong." The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. It wasn't just the awkwardness now. It was the realization that everyone had seen what was going on. They had witnessed the same behavior, the dismissal, the subtle disrespect. It was impossible to ignore any longer. Yet, Mark remained oblivious. He chatted with other tables, laughing at jokes, taking orders with a casual ease, never sparing Mrs. Jacobs a second glance. He hadn't noticed the way people were watching him, the growing murmurs that slowly spread through the restaurant. He hadn't noticed that his every move was under scrutiny. But Miles did. From across the room, Miles watched as Mark turned, laughing again, this time at some joke his friend had made. He looked so self-assured in his behavior, so unconcerned about the undercurrent of tension that was now unmistakable. And that's when the last bit of restraint snapped in Miles. He had been patient, had been watching, letting the scene unfold before him. But this was no longer just about his mother. This was about respect, for her and for everyone in this place. He couldn't sit back any longer. The silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of Miles's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up. The room's collective attention shifted toward him. Miles's expression was stern, but there was an underlying calmness to his demeanor, a controlled kind of anger that hinted at the force he was about to unleash. The waiter was still engaged with the group of young professionals by the window, completely unaware of Miles's approach. But that would soon change. As Miles walked across the room, there was no hesitation in his steps. Every move was deliberate, every footfall resonating in the room like a countdown. The closer he got to Mark, the more his presence became undeniable. And when he was just a few steps away, Mark turned, still oblivious, and found himself face to face with his boss. Miles's voice, when it came, was smooth, but it carried an unmistakable weight. "Mark," he began, his tone measured but firm. "Do you have a moment?" Mark's face froze, the lightheartedness slipping from his features as he quickly adjusted his posture. He had no idea what was coming. His eyes darted around the room, quickly scanning the faces of the nearby patrons. He had been so caught up in his own world that he hadn't noticed the look of disapproval creeping into the eyes of those around him. Yeah, what's up, Miles?" Mark said, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked slightly. Without missing a beat, Miles continued. "You've been serving everyone else in this room, Mark, but there's one guest you've completely ignored." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "My mother." Mark's face paled. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. His stomach twisted as the pieces fell into place. He had been so careless, so dismissive, and now, in front of an entire restaurant, the truth was out. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The young couple at the nearby table exchanged a glance, their eyes wide with surprise. The older man and woman sitting by the bar leaned in closer, no longer whispering, now fully engaged in the scene unfolding before them. But Miles wasn't finished. "I've spent years building this place," he said, his voice never rising, but every word carrying the weight of a lesson. "And if there's one thing I will not tolerate, it's disrespect, not to my guests and certainly not to my family." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was paralyzed by the realization of what he had done, but too ashamed to defend himself. "Do you understand what I'm saying, Mark?" Miles asked, his eyes locking with Mark's, his gaze unwavering. Finally, Mark nodded, his face flushed with humiliation. The room was utterly silent now. No one spoke. They just watched, as the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Miles stepped back, his gaze shifting toward the manager, Dana, who had been watching the entire interaction unfold with a mix of shock and concern. She was standing near the kitchen door, clutching her tablet, her knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. She could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet hum of the room pressing in on her. "Dana," Miles said, his tone now softer, but still commanding. "Take over for Mrs. Jacobs. Make sure she's well taken care of. She deserves that much." Dana nodded quickly, her eyes wide with the urgency of the situation. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor as she moved toward Mrs. Jacobs' table. Meanwhile, Mark stood frozen, his face a mixture of shame and disbelief. His body was rigid, and his mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. But there was no time for excuses. There was no way to undo his actions. He had been caught, and now the consequences were unfolding right before him. Miles turned to Mark, his expression hardening. "You're dismissed for the night, Mark," he said, his voice sharp. "Go home. We'll discuss this further later." The humiliation on Mark's face was evident as he stood motionless for a moment. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply turned and walked out of the restaurant, his footsteps hollow in the silence. His resignation was a silent admission of guilt. As he exited, the door swung closed behind him, leaving the room in an eerie quiet. But that silence was soon broken by Dana's warm voice as she approached Mrs. Jacobs' table. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Dana said, her tone soft and sincere. She quickly filled Mrs. Jacobs' glass with water, her movements gentle and respectful. "I want to make sure you have everything you need tonight. Please let me know how I can assist you." Mrs. Jacobs gave a slight smile, her eyes glimmering with quiet strength. "Thank you, Dana. You're kind." Her voice was warm yet composed, a reflection of the grace she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. With Dana now tending to Mrs. Jacobs' needs, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. Patrons who had been watching from a distance now resumed their meals, but there was a new air of respect in the restaurant. The incident had left its mark, but it had also reinforced the values that Miles had worked so hard to instill in Magnolia's Bistro: respect, dignity, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved to be treated well. The silence in the restaurant seemed to stretch on forever. No one moved, as if they were all waiting for the next moment to unfold, the final piece in a story that had already made its mark on the evening. The staff went about their duties, but their eyes constantly flicked toward Miles, his back straight and his posture radiating a quiet authority. It wasn't just that he was angry. It was something deeper, something that had been brewing for years. The silent betrayal of his mother, the one person who had always stood by him, had stirred something fierce inside him. This wasn't just about one man's failure to serve a customer. It was about something much bigger. Miles stood in the center of the room, his attention still fixed on the doorway where Mark had just exited. He knew he couldn't let this go. The act of disrespect was one thing, but the indifference Mark had shown towards his mother was far worse. Miles felt a knot tighten in his chest. How could someone be so blind to the dignity of another human being? His mother, a woman who had spent her life building others up, deserved far more than what had been handed to her tonight. His mind raced. He'd built this restaurant from the ground up, had poured his heart and soul into it. It wasn't just a place to eat, it was a reflection of his values. To see those values trampled in such a humiliating, subtle way had shaken him to his core. Miles had always believed that the true test of a man was in how he treated those who could do nothing for him. And tonight, Mark had failed that test spectacularly. The door to the restaurant swung open again, the sound of the bell ringing above it filling the silence. It was Mark, standing in the doorway, looking down at the ground, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The staff quickly turned their attention to him, their eyes sharp, but no one said a word. It was as if they all knew what was coming. "Mark," Miles said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. He didn't move, didn't approach. His stillness was its own form of power. "We need to talk." Mark hesitated, his face flushed with embarrassment, before he slowly walked back toward Miles. His feet felt heavy, as if each step was a reminder of the shame he carried. The restaurant, once full of lively conversation and clinking silverware, now felt like a hushed courtroom, awaiting the verdict. When Mark reached Miles, he stood there, his hands fidgeting, his eyes avoiding Miles's. "Look." No," Miles interrupted, his voice cutting through the air. "You don't get to explain yourself just yet." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The other diners, still watching from their tables, waited in anticipation for what would come next. Miles's gaze never wavered from Mark's face. "You treated my mother with disrespect tonight. Not just because you ignored her, but because you saw her as less than human. I watched you, Mark. You laughed and joked, oblivious to what was going on right under your nose." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if the reality of the situation had finally hit him. He had been careless, thoughtless. And now the consequences were undeniable. The room was waiting for an explanation that would never come. Miles took a step closer, his tone unrelenting. "You've been here long enough to know what we stand for. You've seen how we treat our guests, every single one of them. It doesn't matter who they are or where they come from. They deserve respect. You've been taught this, Mark." Mark's face twisted in discomfort as Miles continued. "But tonight you failed. You didn't just fail my mother. You failed this entire restaurant. And that's not something I can let slide." There was a long pause. Mark swallowed, his throat dry. He was a young man, still trying to find his way in the world, but in that moment, he understood the gravity of his actions. The weight of his failure hung heavy in the air. He knew there was no excuse that could make it right. "I'm sorry," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Miles stood still, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the apology that mattered. It wasn't even the words. What mattered was that Mark now understood the magnitude of his mistake. But Miles didn't offer him forgiveness. "Not yet. Sorry isn't enough, Mark," he said quietly. "You need to understand why what you did was wrong. I'm giving you a chance to learn from this, but I won't tolerate this behavior here. Not from anyone." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Miles finally spoke again. "You're dismissed for the evening, Mark," he said, his voice resolute. "Go home. Think about what you've done. We'll talk tomorrow." Mark didn't hesitate. He nodded, his face red with shame, and turned toward the door. But this time, he didn't laugh or joke. He walked out quietly, his head hung low. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, and the restaurant was left in silence once again. The restaurant remained eerily still, the lingering tension slowly dissipating as people went back to their meals, though the atmosphere had undeniably changed. For those who had witnessed the confrontation, the lesson was clear. Miles wasn't just the owner of this restaurant. He was a man who held strong to his values, who wouldn't tolerate disrespect under any circumstance. Dana, who had been attending to Mrs. Jacobs, watched the exchange between Miles and Mark with a mixture of awe and admiration. She had worked in restaurants for years, but she had never seen an owner take such decisive action. She could feel the weight of the moment, the powerful shift in the energy of the place. This wasn't just about one employee. It was about the kind of business Miles wanted to run. A business built on respect, integrity, and the understanding that every guest deserved to be treated with dignity. As the night wore on, the mood in the restaurant slowly lightened. Dana made sure Mrs. Jacobs had everything she needed, and the other patrons who had witnessed the scene seemed to have a new respect for the quiet elegance of the older woman. Her patience, her calm demeanor, and her willingness to endure had made a statement far louder than any confrontation could have. Miles, meanwhile, stood by the bar, his gaze still fixed on the door through which Mark had exited. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but there was a sense of satisfaction that came with knowing he had done the right thing. He had taken a stand, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had ever been treated with disrespect. This restaurant, his restaurant, was more than just a business. It was a place where values mattered, a place where people were treated equally, no matter who they were. And as the last of the evening's customers finished their meals and began to filter out, Miles knew that the lesson had been learned. Not just by Mark, but by everyone who had witnessed the events of the night. This wasn't the kind of place where you could hide your prejudices or ignorance. This was a place where everyone, no matter their background, was worthy of respect. And Miles was determined to make sure that lesson stuck with everyone who worked here, starting with Mark. As he walked his mother to the door, he turned to her with a soft smile, the weight of the evening finally beginning to lift. "You okay, Mom?" She smiled back, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "I'm fine, son. You did well tonight." And with that, they left the restaurant, knowing that the evening had changed something, for the better. As the restaurant continued its evening service, the last few patrons lingered over their meals, some quietly discussing the tense scene they had just witnessed, others attempting to return to the ambiance of the evening. But the staff, now fully aware of the underlying message Miles had delivered, moved with a newfound purpose. Dana, who had rushed to take over Mrs. Jacobs' table after Mark's dismissal, carefully ensured that every need was met with meticulous attention. Her eyes still sharp, but her actions gentler, as if the entire restaurant had just passed through a moment of reckoning. At the far side of the restaurant, Miles finally allowed himself to exhale. The tension that had gripped him for the last hour had begun to ebb away. His pulse, which had raced during the confrontation, had slowed, and a calm resolve settled over him. As the last plates were cleared from the tables, he moved through the restaurant, his strides purposeful and confident, ensuring everything was in order. His gaze lingered on the quiet dignity of his mother as she finished her glass of wine, her eyes thoughtful. The calm with which she had handled the situation, her decision not to engage immediately, had been a lesson in itself. She had allowed the moment to unfold naturally, trusting that Mark's actions would speak louder than anything she could have said. Miles had learned from her example, though he didn't say it aloud. His mother had always been a tower of strength, but tonight, in a single act of defiance and quiet resilience, she had once again shown him what true leadership was. Finally, after making his rounds, Miles joined her at the table. He pulled out the chair opposite her, sitting down with a sigh of exhaustion. His mother, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her, regarded him with a smile that was both knowing and proud. "You did well, son," she said softly. "You didn't just protect me tonight, you protected the heart of this restaurant." Miles leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the distant kitchen doors. "It wasn't just about me, Mom. It was about something bigger. I've spent so long building this place, but I realized tonight that it's more than just a business. It's a statement. It's about how we treat people, everyone. And that starts with how we treat each other in this place." His mother nodded thoughtfully. "I've always believed that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about having the integrity to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." The weight of her words settled in his chest, reminding him of the countless lessons she had imparted over the years. Miles had known these lessons for a long time, but tonight had driven them home in a way he hadn't expected. As much as he had been enraged by Mark's actions, he had been equally proud of how he had handled the situation. He had acted not out of a desire to punish, but out of a need to preserve what was right. "I guess I've got a lot to live up to, don't I?" Miles said, a trace of humor in his voice. "You've set the bar pretty high." His mother laughed, a warm sound that filled the space between them. "I've always said you have the potential to do great things, Miles. But remember, leadership isn't about never making mistakes. It's about owning up to them, learning from them, and making sure others learn too. Tonight, you taught us all a valuable lesson." Miles smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. He felt the weight of the responsibility he carried, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a purpose, a calling. "We'll do better tomorrow," he said with determination, his eyes bright. "And we'll make sure Mark learns from this." But not just him, everyone. This restaurant isn't just about serving food, it's about serving people with respect. I won't let anyone forget that. As the last of the evening's diners trickled out, leaving the restaurant quieter and empty, Miles and his mother shared a look of quiet satisfaction. The events of the night had left their mark, but they both knew that the message had been received. Miles had been tested, not just as a son, but as a leader, and he had passed. The following day, as the restaurant opened its doors to a new round of customers, there was a subtle shift in the energy of the place. The staff, aware of the previous night's events, moved with a renewed sense of purpose. Dana led the team, reminding them of the standards Miles had set, reinforcing the importance of respect and dignity in every interaction. Mark, however, was not in attendance. Miles had given him the day off, but it wasn't out of kindness. Mark's absence was a consequence, a chance for him to reflect on the gravity of his actions. When he returned the next day, he would be expected to apologize to Mrs. Jacobs, and he would have to demonstrate that he understood why his behavior had been unacceptable. This wasn't a lesson to be learned in the form of a reprimand alone. Mark would have to prove, through his actions, that he had grasped the true meaning of respect. As the hours passed and the restaurant filled with guests, Miles observed the way the staff interacted with the patrons. There was a new level of attentiveness, an unspoken commitment to making sure every customer felt valued, heard, and appreciated. The events of the previous night had served as a powerful reminder of what it meant to be part of something greater than oneself. Every server, every chef, every manager understood that their role was about more than just carrying trays or plating food. They were in the business of making people feel seen. In the kitchen, the rhythm of the evening service hummed with energy, but there was a noticeable lightness in the air. The staff worked more closely together, offering each other quiet nods of encouragement, their faces set with a shared understanding of what had transpired the night before. Miles spent his evening circulating through the restaurant, checking in with his guests and staff, making sure the service was running smoothly. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone was enough. People could feel the change, could sense the renewed commitment to the values he had instilled in his business. As the night wound down, Miles found himself back at the bar, his gaze once again finding his mother across the room. She sat with a small group of regulars, laughing softly as they shared stories over a glass of wine. Her presence, calm and unwavering, filled the room with an undeniable warmth. Miles had always admired her strength, but tonight he realized just how much he had come to embody that same quiet resilience. When the last customers left and the lights dimmed, Miles locked the door behind them, pausing for a moment to breathe in the stillness of the night. He had no illusions about the road ahead. Leadership was a continual process, a constant refining of one's values and actions. But for the first time in a long time, Miles felt certain that he was on the right path. He turned to his mother, who had already gathered her things and was preparing to leave. "You're right, Mom," he said quietly. "It's not about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them and making sure we do better next time." His mother smiled, her eyes warm with pride. "That's all anyone can ask for, Miles." And as they walked out of the restaurant together, the soft night air wrapping around them, Miles knew that the lesson of the evening had been internalized, not just by Mark, but by everyone who had witnessed it. It wasn't just about the business. It was about the kind of people they were and the legacy they wanted to leave behind. That night, they both knew that the restaurant had not only become a place where great food was served, but also a place where respect, dignity, and leadership were the true menu. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of that pivotal night continued to shape the atmosphere of the restaurant. Miles knew that the challenges of leadership weren't over, but as he looked around at his team, he saw something different in their eyes, something that hadn't been there before. A shared understanding, a commitment to upholding the values that had always been at the core of his vision. The lesson had been simple, yet profound. Respect wasn't just a rule to follow. It was the foundation upon which everything else stood. Whether it was serving a meal or interacting with a customer, how they treated others reflected who they were as individuals. Miles had learned that leading by example wasn't just about making the right decisions. It was about instilling a culture where those around you felt empowered to do the same. As for Mark, his return to work was met with a level of expectation, but also with an opportunity. He knew he had to prove that he could embody the values that Miles had set. And slowly, step by step, he did. Miles's journey as a leader had only just begun, but with the unwavering support of his mother and the lessons he had learned along the way, he was ready to face whatever challenges came next. Together, they would continue to grow the restaurant, not just as a business, but as a place where everyone, from the waitstaff to the customers, felt valued and respected. And as the doors of the restaurant closed each night, Miles felt a deep sense of pride. Not in the food they served or the profits they made, but in the simple truth that they were building something lasting. A community bound by integrity, kindness, and a shared commitment to making the world a little better, one meal at a time. With every dish that left the kitchen, every conversation between staff and guests, and every decision made, the restaurant became more than just a place to eat. It became a symbol of everything they believed in, a testament to the power of respect, leadership, and the quiet strength that comes from standing up for what's right. And that was something worth fighting for. Thank you so much for staying with us and listening to the entire story. We hope you enjoyed this journey as much as we enjoyed sharing it with you. Your time and attention mean the world to us, and we're grateful for your support. If you liked the story and found it inspiring, please give us a thumbs up, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on our future videos. Your support helps us grow and continue bringing you more content that we hope you'll love. Thanks again for being part of this experience. We look forward to seeing you in the next one.